The grand ballroom of Ashcroft Manor glittered beneath crystal chandeliers as wealthy guests gathered for the Foundation's prestigious charity luncheon. Executives, philanthropists, and influential families filled the room, dressed in expensive suits and evening gowns. Moving quietly among them was Belle Dawson, a temporary housekeeper in a simple black and white uniform. Belle rarely attracted attention, and she preferred it that way. That afternoon, a young waiter nearly collided with another server while carrying a tray. Belle stepped aside quickly and prevented the coffee pot in her hands from falling. Nothing was broken, and no guest was harmed. But Julianne Ashcroft noticed the brief delay. "What happened?" she demanded. Belle answered calmly. "One of the servers lost his balance. Everything is under control." Julianne looked toward the waiting guests. Whose fault was it? Belle knew the young waiter was terrified. Instead of blaming him, she replied, "I'll take care of the service." Julianne narrowed her eyes. "So it was your fault?" "No," Belle said quietly. "I said I would handle it. I didn't say I caused it." Several nearby guests turned toward them. Julianne was not accustomed to being corrected, especially by an employee. "You seem to have forgotten your position." "I haven't." "You are here to serve." "Yes." "Then stop arguing." Belle lowered her gaze. "I'm not arguing. I simply can't admit to something I didn't do." Julianne's expression hardened. Without warning, she picked up a cup of steaming coffee and threw it directly across Belle's chest. A gasp moved through the ballroom. The hot liquid soaked through Belle's uniform and splashed across her wrist. Pain shot through her skin. But she did not scream. She did not cry. She simply placed the coffee pot safely on the table and pressed a napkin against the burn. Several guests looked away. Others pretended nothing had happened. Trevor Miles, the estate operations manager, had witnessed everything. Yet fear kept him silent. Julianne smiled coldly. "Perhaps now you'll remember where you belong." Belle said nothing. That silence seemed to anger Julianne even more. She stepped closer and raised her hand to shove Belle. Her hand never reached her. Someone caught Julianne's wrist. The ballroom fell completely silent. Nikolai Ashcroft stood beside her. He had returned to the manor earlier than expected and had seen enough to understand what was happening. His voice was calm. "Who gave you permission to touch someone under my roof?" Julianne froze. "Nikolai. You don't understand." "I understand that she is burned." He released Julianne and removed his charcoal overcoat. Stepping toward Belle, he gently placed it around her shoulders, covering the coffee stains. "You need medical attention." Belle shook her head. "I'm all right." "Sit." "The luncheon is behind schedule." Nikolai stared at her. "You're worried about lunch. The guests came to support the foundation." "You were just injured." "Yes. But the work still needs to be done." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned toward the ballroom. Who saw what happened? Silence. Dozens of people had witnessed the confrontation. Yet no one immediately answered. Julianne forced a laugh. "It was an accident." Nikolai did not look at her. "I wasn't asking you." Finally, an elderly guest spoke. "I saw it. Miss Dawson did nothing wrong." Another guest added, "The coffee was thrown deliberately." Then another voice followed. "She never raised her voice." Miss Ashcroft tried to push her afterward. On everyone. The truth began to emerge. Nikolai looked toward Trevor. "You supervised the staff today." "Yes." "Sid. Did you see what happened?" Trevor hesitated before finally admitting. "Yes." "Was Miss Dawson responsible for the serving problem?" "No." "And the coffee?" Trevor swallowed. Miss Ashcroft threw it deliberately. Julianne stared at him furiously. "You coward." Trevor lowered his eyes. Nikolai turned back to Belle. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" Belle paused. "There wasn't much point." "You could have." "I could." "Then why didn't you?" Belle looked around the ballroom before answering. "The guests deserved a peaceful luncheon more than I deserved the last word." The room fell quiet again. This time, several people looked ashamed. Nikolai noticed the redness spreading across Belle's wrist. Edith. The head housekeeper hurried forward. Take Miss Dawson to the medical suite. Belle immediately objected. There are still desserts to prepare. The desserts can wait. Nikolai replied. Your health cannot. Belle finally looked directly at him. There was no pity in his expression. Only respect. Thank you, she whispered. Laughter. In the medical suite, Edith treated the minor burn while Belle apologized for disrupting the luncheon. Edith stared at her in disbelief. You were the one who was burned. Belle. I know. And you're apologizing. Belle smiled faintly. I suppose it's a bid. A few minutes later, Nikolai entered. How serious? Minor, Edith said. She'll recover. Nikolai nodded with relief. Belle immediately stood. You don't need to stand, he told her. I'm still your employee. You're receiving medical treatment. Belle smiled slightly. I can apparently do both. For the first time, Nikolai almost smiled. He looked at her bandaged wrist. Why didn't you ask me to punish Julianne? Belle thought carefully. What she did was wrong. But anger doesn't have to decide what I do next. Nikolai studied her. You're not angry. I am. She glanced at the bandage. But if I spend the entire day hating her, then she gets the coffee, the humiliation, and the rest of my afternoon too. That answer surprised him. Belle looked toward the door. I should get back to work. You've been excused for the day. The pastries haven't. Despite himself, Nikolai gave a quiet laugh. Belle thanked him once more and left the room. He remained alone by the window. For years, Nikolai had believed he understood people quickly. He knew greed, ambition, fear, and pride. But Belle Dawson confused him. She had been publicly humiliated and demanded no revenge. She had been injured and worried about unfinished work. She had been treated as though she had no value. Yet she refused to treat anyone else the same way. For the first time, Nikolai found himself wondering who the quiet woman behind the housekeeping uniform truly was. In the days after the charity luncheon, Belle returned to work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The burn on her wrist was still covered by a neat bandage. Yet she never used it as an excuse to slow down. She arrived before sunrise, stayed when other departments were short-staffed, and quietly helped wherever she was needed. Nikolai noticed that she never seemed to seek attention, but attention followed her anyway. An elderly housekeeper struggling with heavy linens found half the load taken from her hands before she could ask. A nervous new waiter who dropped a tray was met not with criticism but with a calm joke that made him breathe again. In the laundry room, Belle turned a small disaster involving a collapsed stack of towels into something that had the entire team laughing within seconds. What interested Nikolai most was not her kindness itself, but its effect on everyone around her. Employees worked more smoothly when Belle was nearby. Arguments ended faster. Younger staff asked her questions they were afraid to ask their supervisors. Even experienced workers seemed less tense after speaking with her. She had no title, no authority, and no reason for anyone to follow her. Yet people naturally trusted her judgment. One afternoon, a guest complained angrily that his room had not been prepared, according to his preferences. Trevor was still on his way when Belle stepped in. She listened without interrupting, apologized for the inconvenience without accepting blame for things that had not happened, and quietly arranged a solution before the guest's frustration could grow. By the time Trevor arrived, the man was calm and thanking her. Nikolai had watched the entire exchange from across the corridor. Later that same week, a disagreement broke out between the kitchen and housekeeping teams over missing linens for a private dinner. Voices rose. Accusations began, and neither side seemed willing to compromise. Belle entered carrying fresh towels, listened for less than a minute, then asked 3 simple questions. Within 5 minutes, the missing inventory was found. Both departments understood where the mistake had occurred, and the argument disappeared. Nikolai began to wonder whether the employment file in front of him was incomplete. Temporary housekeeper. Minimal references. No management history. Nothing about her behavior matched the simplicity of those records. He finally went to Edith. The head housekeeper was organizing supply reports when Nikolai entered her office. "I want to ask you something about Belle Dawson." Edith looked up slowly. "I wondered when you would." Nikolai folded his arms. "She doesn't work like someone who has spent her life cleaning rooms." A faint smile appeared on Edith's face. "No, she doesn't." "You know why?" Edith hesitated. For several seconds, she seemed to weigh whether the story belonged to her to tell. Then she removed her glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. 5 years ago, I attended an international hospitality conference. One of the keynote sessions recognized young operations leaders who had transformed underperforming luxury properties. Nikolai listened without interruption. There was one woman everyone talked about. She had reorganized entire departments, improved guest satisfaction, reduced staff turnover, and earned the loyalty of hundreds of employees. She was intelligent, composed, and unusually good at making people feel respected. Edith looked toward the door. That woman was Belle. Nikolai's expression changed. She was an operations manager, one of the best I had ever seen. She managed a luxury hotel, hundreds of employees, housekeeping, guest services, banquets, front desk, events. She received awards for the results. Nikolai glanced toward the stack of employment papers on Edith's desk. Then why is none of that in her file? Edith's expression softened. Because she left that life behind. There was more in her voice than professional explanation. Nikolai waited. Her mother became ill. Edith continued. Cancer. The treatment lasted for years. The room grew still. Belle used her savings first. Then she sold investments. Then her apartment. Eventually, she resigned because caring for her mother became a full-time responsibility. Nikolai said nothing. When her mother died, Belle had almost nothing left. No position. No savings. Very few professional connections. Only medical debt and a life she had to rebuild. For the first time, the story behind Belle's quietness began to make sense. She never told anyone here. No. Why? Edith smiled sadly. I asked her that once. And she told me, if people respect me only because of my old title, then they never respected me at all. The sentence stayed with Nikolai long after he left the office. He had spent years surrounded by people who introduced themselves through accomplishments, money, influence, and reputation. Belle had done the opposite. She had hidden every achievement and accepted the lowest position in the household without complaint. Determined to earn respect again without using the past as leverage. The following morning, rain covered the stone courtyard in a thin silver mist. Nikolai was crossing toward the main building when he noticed Belle near the garden entrance. An elderly gardener was struggling to move several heavy flower containers before guests arrived. Belle immediately set down the basket in her hands. I'll take the other side. The gardener shook his head. Your wrist is still healing. It still works. Together, they lifted the first planter and carried it into place. Then another. By the time they finished, mud had splashed across Belle's clean uniform and dampened the knees of her trousers. She looked down at herself and laughed. I lasted almost 15 minutes today. The gardener smiled. A new record. Neither of them noticed Nikolai standing beneath the covered walkway. He watched Belle brush soil from her sleeve and pick up the basket she had abandoned. Now he knew what she had once been. He knew about the awards, the career, the employees who had trusted her, and the life she had sacrificed for her mother. Yet none of those things were what held his attention. What stayed with him was simpler. Belle had lost nearly everything that once defined her. And somehow loss had not made her hard. She still stopped when someone needed help. She still chose patience when resentment would have been understandable. She still carried other people's burdens even when no one was watching. For Nikolai, curiosity had become something deeper. Not attraction yet. Not love. Respect. And for a man who rarely gave it easily, that was far more significant. Julianne noticed the change before anyone said it aloud. Nikolai did not treat Belle with favoritism, nor did he seek her out without reason. But there was something in the way he listened when she spoke, the way he acknowledged her judgment, and the quiet respect he showed whenever they crossed paths. To most employees, it seemed harmless. To Julianne, it felt intolerable. She had spent years believing attention belonged naturally to people like her. Wealth, family name, and social position had always guaranteed that others would listen. Now, a temporary housekeeper was receiving something Julianne valued even more than attention: credibility. She decided not to confront Belle directly again. The first incident had already placed too many eyes on her. Instead, she chose something subtler. At first, the remark seemed casual. During coffee with several department supervisors, Julianne stirred her tea and said, "Some people are very clever about making themselves indispensable." No one answered. She smiled faintly. "They stay late? Volunteer for every unpleasant task. Always happen to be nearby when the right person is watching." One supervisor shifted uncomfortably. Julianne continued, "Of course, maybe I'm being unfair. Perhaps kindness really is always selfless." That was all she needed to say. By the next day, the suggestion had grown. Belle was working overtime because she wanted Nikolai to notice. She helped older employees because she knew he admired loyalty. Her modest behavior was supposedly calculated. Within a week, the rumor had become something uglier. Belle wanted money. Belle wanted status. Belle wanted to become the next Mrs. Ashcroft. No one could identify who had first said it. That was exactly how Julianne wanted it. Belle felt the change almost immediately. Conversations stopped when she entered the staff dining room. Coworkers who once saved her a seat suddenly remembered somewhere else they needed to be. A young maid who had often asked Belle for advice began avoiding her entirely. Two employees quietly requested different assignments. At first, Belle pretended not to notice. Then one evening, she carried her dinner tray into the cafeteria and watched 3 people rise from a nearby table within seconds of her arrival. That hurt. She took her meal to the far corner and sat alone. Edith found her there. "You know what's happening?" Belle nodded. "Yes. And you're going to let them say those things." Belle looked down at her tea. "What would you like me to do?" "Tell them the truth. They already know enough of it. They're saying you're trying to marry Nikolai for his money." Belle gave a tired smile. "I barely speak to him outside work. That doesn't matter to people who enjoy a better story." For once, Belle had no light-hearted answer. Later that night, she returned to her small staff apartment and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. For several minutes, she did nothing. Years earlier, hundreds of employees had trusted her decisions. Managers had sought her advice. Executives had shaken her hand after successful conferences and record-breaking seasons. Now people who barely knew her were whispering that every act of kindness had been a performance. Belle pressed her hands together. The accusation hurt because it attacked the one thing she still believed belonged entirely to her character. For a brief moment, anger tempted her. She imagined confronting Julianne in front of everyone. She imagined revealing her old career, her awards, everything she had sacrificed for her mother. She could prove she had once possessed far more status than anyone at the manor knew. But by morning, she had decided against it. When Edith asked why, Belle answered quietly, "If I have to advertise every good thing I've ever done just to prove I'm not pretending, then the rumors have already changed me." Edith sighed. "You make forgiveness look easy. It isn't." Belle looked toward the staff corridor where several employees had just passed without greeting her. "It's simply lighter than carrying anger everywhere." Across the manor, Nikolai began noticing the tension. Departments that had worked smoothly were suddenly blaming one another over minor mistakes. Staff meetings felt colder. Belle's name disappeared from conversations the moment he entered. Then one afternoon, while crossing the kitchen corridor, he heard two young maids whispering near the pantry. "I heard she's trying to become Mrs. Ashcroft." The second maid frowned. "But have you ever seen her flirt with him? You don't have to." "That's the point. Women like that are patient." Nikolai stopped. Both women turned and immediately went pale. "Who told you that?" he asked. Neither answered. "People are talking." One finally whispered. "People have names." Silence. Nikolai studied them for a moment. "Return to work." They hurried away. He remained in the corridor alone. He had spent years managing companies where false information could cost millions. Rumors interested him not because they revealed truth, but because they often revealed motive. That evening, he began reviewing everything connected to Belle. Attendance record, guest complaints, overtime sheets, staff evaluations, department notes. There was nothing suspicious. No complaints about inappropriate behavior. No evidence she had ever requested special treatment. No record of her using Nikolai's name to gain advantage. Instead, her file contained praise. Dépendable, calm under pressure, excellent with guests, supports junior staff, volunteers when departments are short. Nikolai kept reading. The more evidence he examined, the more obvious the contrast became between Belle's actual behavior and the story circulating through the manor. Then he requested security footage from the original luncheon. 3 days later, a private meeting was scheduled in the executive conference room. Julianne arrived first, perfectly dressed and outwardly confident. Trevor came next, followed by Edith, the estate's legal advisor, and the head of security. Nikolai sat at the far end of the table. No one spoke. Finally, he looked toward the security director. "Begin." The screen behind him came to life. The ballroom appeared. The footage showed Belle carrying coffee toward the service area. A waiter stepped backward. She moved aside. No argument. No confrontation. Then Julianne entered the frame. The audio was clear. "You'll take responsibility." Belle answered. "I can't admit to something I didn't do." The video continued. Julianne lifted the cup. She threw the coffee. Belle stood still. Then Julianne raised her hand toward her again. A moment later, Nikolai entered the frame and caught her wrist. The recording ended. No one moved. Julianne gave a short laugh. Security cameras don't always capture context. Nikolai said nothing. The legal advisor opened a case and placed several phones on the table. Julianne frowned. "What is this?" "Guest recordings." The advisor replied. The first video played from another angle, then a second, then a third. One guest had been filming the floral decorations. Another was recording a speech. A volunteer had accidentally captured the confrontation while testing a live stream. 7 recordings in total. Different positions. Different devices. The same truth. Julianne's composure began to crack. "They're trying to embarrass me." Nikolai finally spoke. "No. They're preserving facts." Her jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous." "Is it? You're acting as though I committed some terrible crime. You deliberately humiliated an employee in front of hundreds of people." Julianne leaned forward. "She is a housekeeper." The room went still. Nikolai held her gaze. "I am not responding because she is a housekeeper." He paused. "I am responding because you forgot she is a person." Julianne looked around the table. No one defended her. Not Trevor. Not Edith. Not the legal advisor. Not even the security director. Nikolai opened a folder. Inside were estate management documents. He signed 2 pages and slid them across the table. Effective immediately. "You are relieved of all operational authority at Ashcroft Manor." Julianne stared at him. "You can't do that." "I already have. This is my family too." "Your family name remains unchanged." "My authority." Nikolai's voice stayed calm. "You surrendered it when you decided power mattered more than character." Julianne stood abruptly. "You're choosing a servant over your own blood." Nikolai did not raise his voice. I chose character over entitlement. The words settled across the room. Julianne looked at him for several seconds, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind her. Nikolai looked toward Trevor. You witnessed the original incident. Trevor nodded. Yes. And said nothing until you were directly questioned. I was afraid. I believe you. Trevor looked surprised. Nikolai continued. Fear explains silence. It does not excuse it. Trevor lowered his head. You will complete leadership ethics training before returning to supervisory duties. Yes. Sir. The meeting ended without celebration. There was no applause, no sense of victory, only consequences. Later that afternoon, the manor received an official notice confirming Julianne's removal from household operations. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Employees who had believed the rumors began approaching Belle. Some apologized directly. Others offered awkward smiles. One young maid stood before her with tears in her eyes. I shouldn't have believed what people were saying. Belle shook her head gently. You don't owe me a speech. But I avoided you. I noticed. The maid looked ashamed. Belle smiled. Then do better next time. That was all. She never asked who had repeated Julianne's accusations. She never demanded that anyone choose sides. She never celebrated Julianne's humiliation. When Edith asked whether she felt satisfied, Belle thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because someone losing power doesn't repair what they did. Edith studied her. Belle continued. But maybe what happens next can... Over the following days, the manor slowly returned to normal. Conversations became warmer. Departments began cooperating again. People who had once watched Belle with suspicion started seeing the same person who had been there all along. Nothing about her had changed. Only their willingness to see it. Nikolai understood that clearly. Julianne had tried to destroy Belle by controlling the story. Instead, evidence had stripped away every invention. Belle had not needed revenge. She had not needed to expose anyone herself. The truth had done the work for her. And in the end, Julianne lost her authority not because Belle defeated her, but because her own choices finally became impossible to hide. Several weeks after Julianne lost her authority at Ashcroft Manor, life settled into a calmer rhythm. Belle continued working exactly as she had before, arriving early, helping wherever she was needed, and refusing to treat the attention surrounding her as anything important. If anything, she seemed relieved that people had finally stopped whispering. One rainy afternoon, Edith found her organizing supplies in the housekeeping office. Mr. Ashcroft wants to see you at 3. Belle stopped writing. Did he say why? No. For the next 2 hours, she quietly imagined every possible reason. Perhaps her temporary contract was ending. Perhaps there had been a complaint. Perhaps Nikolai wanted to discuss the publicity surrounding Julianne. None of those possibilities prepared her for the folder waiting on his desk. When Belle entered his office, Nikolai motioned toward the chair across from him. Please sit. She did. You wanted to see me. Nikolai pushed the folder toward her. I've been reviewing the hospitality programs operated by the Ashcroft Foundation. We support senior centers, shelters, medical charities, and community organizations. But the quality of our guest services varies too much from one program to another. Belle nodded. That sounds difficult to coordinate. It is. Which is why I need someone to rebuild the system. She glanced at the folder. I hope you find the right person. I believe I already have. Belle looked up. Nikolai opened the folder. At the top of the first page were the words, Director of Hospitality Ashcroft Foundation. Belle stared at them. Then at him. I don't understand. I'm offering you the position. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she slowly pushed the folder back. No. Nikolai appeared more curious than offended. No. I appreciate what you're trying to do. What am I trying to do? Help me. Yes. Belle shook her head. Not like this. His expression remained calm. You think this is charity? I think you know what happened to my career. You know about my mother. You know how I ended up here. I do. And now you feel responsible for giving me back what I lost. Nikolai leaned slightly forward. I don't feel responsible for your life. Belle. She blinked at the use of her first name. He continued. I verified your professional history. You managed hundreds of employees. You rebuilt departments that were failing. You improved guest satisfaction, reduced staff turnover, and trained managers who still hold senior positions today. Belle looked away. That was years ago. Experience does not disappear because life interrupted it. I've been cleaning rooms. You've been leading people. She looked back at him. I don't have authority here. That is precisely what interests me. Nikolai closed the folder. People listen to you without being required to. They trust you without being instructed to. When departments disagree, you solve the problem. When someone makes a mistake, you correct it without humiliating them. He paused. I didn't hire the housekeeper. I hired the leader hidden beneath the uniform. Belle was silent. The words reached a place inside her. She had spent years protecting the tooted. What if that person isn't there anymore? She is? You sound very certain. I am. Why? Because I've watched her work. Belle looked again at the title printed across the page. Her voice became quieter. What if I fail? Nikolai answered immediately. Then you learn why. Correct it. And try again. That isn't very reassuring. It wasn't intended to be. A reluctant laugh escaped her. Nikolai smiled. I'm not offering you a rescue, Belle. I'm offering you responsibility. Considerably more responsibility than you currently have. She studied him carefully. And if I'm not good enough, then I will have made a poor hiring decision. That would bother you. Enormously. She laughed again. The tension finally broke. Belle pulled the folder toward herself. I want to earn this. You already earned the opportunity. That isn't the same as earning the position. No. Nikolai agreed. It isn't. That answer was exactly what she needed. Belle picked up the pen. Then I suppose I have work to do. Her first months as director of hospitality were not easy. The Ashcroft Foundation was far more complicated than the luxury hotel Belle had once managed. Each facility had different needs, different budgets, and different cultures. Some senior employees questioned why a former housekeeper had suddenly been given executive authority. Others assumed Nikolai had promoted her because of the scandal. Belle refused to argue with them. She let the work answer instead. Her first major initiative focused on the foundation's senior care centers. Rather than beginning with expensive renovations, she spent weeks speaking directly with residents, nurses, volunteers, receptionists, cleaners, and families. What she discovered surprised the board. Most complaints had little to do with luxury. Residents wanted staff members to remember their names. Families wanted clearer communication. Wheelchair users wanted pathways that were actually convenient rather than technically compliant. Volunteers wanted to feel useful instead of disposable. Belle redesigned the program around those details. She introduced hospitality training that emphasized dignity rather than obedience. Staff members were taught to listen before solving problems. Managers were expected to learn the names of junior employees. Volunteers received proper orientation instead of being handed tasks without explanation. Belle also introduced one rule that initially sounded almost too simple. No employee was too important to help. If a director saw a spilled drink, the director could pick up a towel. If an executive noticed an elderly guest struggling with a chair, the executive could move it. Leadership, Belle insisted, should be visible most clearly when no one was required to perform it. The results appeared slowly. Then all at once, complaints declined. Volunteer retention improved. Guest satisfaction rose. Donations increased as visitors began commenting on how different the foundation's events felt. Warm, personal, human, within 6 months. Even the executives who had questioned Belle's appointment were asking for her advice. Nikolai watched without interfering. He had opened the door. Belle had walked through it entirely on her own. Their professional relationship deepened as her responsibilities grew. They attended board meetings together, visited community centers, reviewed budgets, and occasionally traveled to foundation events in neighboring cities. Neither spoke about the attraction developing beneath their conversations. There was no dramatic moment when everything changed. Instead, there were small things. Belle discovered that Nikolai remembered she preferred tea to coffee. He learned that she hated unnecessarily long meetings. She noticed that he always read every employee report before reviewing financial summaries. He noticed she remembered the names of security guards, drivers, cleaners, and volunteers as easily as she remembered board members. On late evenings, when most employees had gone home, they sometimes remained in the conference room reviewing plans. Nikolai would appear with 2 cups of tea. Belle would look at the clock and say, "You realize normal people have gone home. You're still here." I never claimed to be normal. Neither did I. Those conversations gradually became the part of Belle's workdays she looked forward to most, not because Nikolai was wealthy, not because he had given her an opportunity, because he listened. When they disagreed, he did not dismiss her. When she challenged his decisions, he considered the argument rather than the hierarchy between them. And when she succeeded, he never behaved as though her achievements belonged partly to him. Months passed. Belle became increasingly confident in her new role. The woman who had once entered Ashcroft Manor wearing a temporary housekeeping uniform now walked into executive meetings without hesitation. Her confidence returned differently than before. It was quieter, less dependent on recognition. She no longer needed her old career back. She was building something new. One evening, nearly a year after her appointment, Belle remained late after a fundraising event. The conference room was empty except for scattered reports and 2 abandoned glasses of water. Nikolai entered carrying tea. Belle smiled. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten." "Impossibly." He handed her the cup. She took a sip. "Exactly right. I know. That confidence is becoming irritating. I've been told." They stood beside the windows overlooking the city. After a comfortable silence, Belle asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you believe me so quickly?" Nikolai turned toward her. "At the luncheon." She nodded. "You barely knew me." Everyone else hesitated. He considered the question. "Because you weren't trying to convince me." Belle frowned. "What does that mean?" People who know they are guilty often become desperate to control the story. They explain too much. They interrupt. They blame someone else before anyone asks. And I didn't. You were worried about dessert. Belle laughed. That does sound ridiculous now. It sounded ridiculous then. She nudged him lightly with her elbow before realizing what she had done. They both paused. Then Nikolai smiled. Belle looked back toward the city. "My mother would have liked you." The words surprised both of them. Nikolai's expression softened. "Why?" She respected people who didn't need to announce their importance. "That sounds familiar." Belle smiled. "She used to tell me that character is what remains when everything else is taken away." Nikolai was quiet for a moment. She was right. Belle looked at him. "When she died, I thought I had lost everything that made me who I was. My career was gone. My savings were gone. Even my confidence disappeared." "You lost circumstances." She waited. Nikolai continued. "You didn't lose yourself." Belle lowered her eyes. "You helped me remember that." "No." His answer came gently. "You did that yourself." The silence between them changed. For months, they had carefully remained behind the boundary of professionalism. Neither had wanted gratitude to be confused with affection or authority to complicate something that needed to develop freely. Now Belle no longer depended on him. She had her own position, her own reputation, her own future. And Nikolai knew that if he said what he had been carrying for months, she could walk away without losing any of it. That mattered to him. "Belle." Something in his voice made her turn. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I have spent most of my life making decisions without hesitation. I've negotiated acquisitions worth billions. I've faced people who intimidate entire industries. Belle smiled slightly. This sounds dangerously dramatic. It is becoming worse. She laughed. Nikolai did not. His sincerity made her smile disappear. When you first came here, I respected the way you handled yourself. Then I respected the way you treated people. Somewhere along the way, respect became admiration. Belle remained still, and eventually, he continued. Admiration became something I could no longer pretend was only professional. Her eyes softened. I didn't tell you earlier because I never wanted you to wonder whether your position depended on how you answered. Belle understood immediately. And now your position would survive even if you threw tea at me. She laughed. That is useful information. I immediately regret mentioning it. Belle looked down at the cup in her hands. Then her voice became quiet. I've been trying not to admit something too. Nikolai waited. I started noticing which meetings had your name on them. A faint smile appeared on his face. That sounds serious. It gets worse. Oh, I started looking forward to them. He laughed softly. Belle took one step closer. I admired you because you defended someone who couldn't offer you anything in return. Then I trusted you because you never asked me to become indebted to you for it. She looked directly into his eyes. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you only as the man who gave me another opportunity. Nikolai did not move toward her. Instead, he offered his hand. The gesture was almost formal. But Belle understood what it meant. En invitation, not a claim. She placed her hand in his. For a moment, neither spoke. Their relationship had not begun with love at first sight. It had not grown from rescue, gratitude, or wealth. It had started with respect. Respect became trust. Trust became friendship. Friendship became admiration. And only when Belle had rebuilt a life that belonged completely to her did they finally allow admiration to become love. Standing together beside the windows, they were no longer the billionaire owner and the temporary housekeeper he had once defended. They were simply Nikolai and Belle, two people who had learned to recognize in each other the same thing they valued most in themselves: character that remained when titles, money, and appearances no longer mattered. 1 year later, Ashcroft Manor hosted another charity luncheon beneath the same crystal chandeliers that had once witnessed Belle Dawson's humiliation. The ballroom looked almost unchanged. White flowers decorated the tables. Silver trays moved between elegantly dressed guests, and soft music drifted through the room. Yet the atmosphere was completely different. The change could not be found in the decorations or the guest list. It lived in the way people treated one another. Managers thanked employees by name. Senior executives carried their own plates when the service staff were busy. Supervisors stepped in to help instead of standing at a distance and giving orders. Younger workers no longer lowered their voices whenever someone important entered the room. There was still discipline, but fear had disappeared from it. Much of that transformation had begun with Belle, now director of hospitality for the Ashcroft Foundation. She had spent the past year building a culture around one simple principle: dignity was not a privilege reserved for guests or executives. It belonged to everyone. Marriage had not changed that belief. Belle was now Nikolai Ashcroft's wife. But she never used the title to place herself above anyone. She still remembered the names of kitchen assistants, security guards, gardeners, and cleaners. She still helped carry boxes when she saw someone struggling. If a volunteer made a mistake, she corrected it without humiliation. If a manager forgot that lesson, Belle reminded them. That afternoon, she moved through the ballroom checking the final details of the luncheon when a sudden crash echoed from the service corridor. Conversation stopped. A young maid stood frozen beside a shattered tray. Crystal glasses lay across the marble floor. Juice had splashed over the front of her uniform, and one broken stem rolled slowly beneath a nearby table. The girl's face went pale. "I'm so sorry." Her hands began to shake. "I'll pay for everything. Please." "I didn't mean to." She looked around as though waiting for someone to shout. No one did. Before any supervisor could reach her, Belle crossed the room. The maid's eyes widened when she realized who was approaching. Mrs. Ashcroft. I'm sorry. I ruined the luncheon. Belle stopped beside her. Then, without hesitation, she knelt on the floor. The young woman stared at her. Belle picked up a clean towel and placed it over the spilled juice. You didn't ruin anything. The maid looked at the broken glasses. But the tray, you dropped a tray. Belle gave her a gentle smile. You didn't ruin the luncheon. Those are two very different things. For a moment, the girl seemed unable to speak. Belle motioned toward the glass. Don't touch the broken pieces with your hands. Let's clear a safe path first. Two nearby employees immediately joined them. Another worker brought a broom. Within moments, the dangerous pieces were removed, and fresh drinks were already being prepared. What might once have become a public humiliation had turned into a minor inconvenience. The maid remained beside Belle, still embarrassed. I thought I was going to be fired. Belle looked at her. For dropping a tray, the girl lowered her eyes. At my last job, mistakes like this were treated differently. Belle understood more than the maid could possibly know. She remembered another luncheon, another stained uniform, another room full of people watching. She remembered hot coffee burning her skin while powerful guests looked away. And she remembered a coat placed around her shoulders by a man who had chosen to see a person where others had seen only an employee. Belle's expression softened. Mistakes should teach you something, she said. They shouldn't teach you that you have no value. The maid looked up. Why are you helping me? Belle smiled. Because someone once helped me when I needed it most? Across the ballroom, Nikolai had watched the entire scene. He had not stepped forward because he knew Belle did not need him to. She was no longer the woman standing silently beneath his coat while strangers debated whether her pain mattered. She had rebuilt her career, reclaimed her confidence, and helped transform the very place where she had once been treated as invisible. Yet success had changed none of the qualities that first made him notice her. A distinguished guest standing beside Nikolai followed his gaze. Your wife has an unusual way of handling problems. Nikolai smiled. She believes people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what went wrong. The guest watched as Belle helped the young maid straighten her uniform. I've wanted to ask you something. Nikolai turned. What? Why did you marry her? The question might have sounded inappropriate from someone else. But there was genuine curiosity behind it. Nikolai did not answer immediately. He looked across the room. Belle had discovered that one glass had survived the fall and rolled beneath a table. She held it up with exaggerated triumph. One survivor. A few employees laughed. The frightened maid finally smiled. Nikolai's expression softened. He had known people with more money than they could spend. People whose names opened doors across continents. People surrounded by possessions so rare that museums would have displayed them behind glass. None of those things had ever impressed him as much as what Belle carried effortlessly, because kindness is the rarest luxury I've ever owned. The guest fell silent. Belle glanced across the ballroom and caught Nikolai looking at her. She smiled. He walked toward her. By the time he reached her side, the broken tray had disappeared, and the luncheon had continued as though nothing serious had happened. Belle looked at him. You were watching. I was. And you didn't rescue me from the terrifying crisis of spilled juice. You seemed capable. Very wise. He offered her his hand. She took it. For a moment, they stood together beneath the chandeliers. A year earlier, Belle had occupied that same room as a temporary housekeeper whose dignity had been treated as disposable. Now she stood beside Nikolai not because marriage had elevated her, and not because wealth had given her worth. She stood there as his equal because she had always possessed something no title could create. Character. The manner had changed because people had watched Belle lead without cruelty and correct without humiliation. They had seen Nikolai use authority without arrogance. Slowly, a household once governed by fear had learned a different language. Respect. The lesson spread far beyond one broken tray or one charity luncheon. Power could force people to obey. Money could purchase comfort. Status could attract attention. But none of those things could create loyalty. Trust. or love. Those had to be earned. Belle looked once more toward the young maid, who was now laughing quietly with another employee as she returned to work. That small smile meant more to her than any title she had ever held. Because the greatest proof of Belle's success was not that she had escaped humiliation. It was that she had helped build a place where someone else would never have to endure the same thing. Nikolai gently squeezed her hand. She looked at him. Ready. For what? The speech you promised to give. Belle sighed dramatically. I was hoping everyone had forgotten. They haven't. Can I disappear into the kitchen? You're the director of hospitality. That sounds like a yes. He laughed. Together. They walked toward the ballroom. This time, Belle did not enter as someone standing behind the guests. She walked beside Nikolai. Completely herself. And everyone who knew their story understood what had truly transformed Ashcroft Manor. It was not wealth. It was not authority. It was not even love alone. It was the respect that had made love possible in the first place. Power commands attention. Kindness earns devotion. And respect is the foundation strong enough to make both leadership and love last